very good chance now that change this regime with the help of the ballot, not with the bullet.
Muslims need to participate and need to vote, and we've advised the Muslim community to assess candidates on 4 issues: the war in Iraq, the issue of Palestine, the issue of civil liberties, and the issue of Islamophobia.
Evelyn Waugh, the great novelist, who I think is familiar to most people because most people have watched Brideshead Revisited on television, once said that he had never voted in a national election in his life. Well, I can go one better than that. I've never even voted in a local election. And the reason for this is, quite frankly, I do not believe in democracy.
Can you please define democracy for the benefit of the viewers?
Well, I think the usual definition that is being given is where the one man, one vote, where you're really able to exercise your right to vote in a system that takes a collective view of what we are saying, and with the majority view prevails.
Well, my theory is that democracy, liberal democracy, consists of 2 components: a procedural component, which is compatible with Islam, and a philosophical component, which we have problem with. And what I call on Muslims is to pay attention to the procedural component, which involves electing a government, making a government accountable, upholding the rule of law, and equality before the law, respecting human rights. Now, the philosophical component is to do with a world vision, how we see ourselves, how we see the world. We Muslims have a world vision of our own.
Democracy is the rule of the demos, of the people. Islam is theocracy, it is the rule of God. Demos and theos stand at opposite ends of the ontological spectrum, confronting one another as opposites. And it is only that which created man that can decide how he is intended to live. In other words, when those parties legislate, and all parties legislate, they are encroaching on a function which exclusively belongs to God. And this is kufr.
There is no contradiction between the sovereignty of God and the sovereignty of the people. The sovereignty of God in Islam is to do with the frame of reference in legislation, but the sovereignty of the people is to do with choosing a government and making that government accountable. It is not God that chooses the government for us. It's not God that makes it accountable. It's we, the people, who decide that.
Sovereignty belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sovereignty belongs to the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when it comes to authority, Islam believes that authority belongs to the people. So there's no problem in terms of the authority belonging to the people, in the sense that the people, they choose their rulers, they account their rulers, they establish political parties which account their rulers, and there's an independent judiciary which again accounts the rulers. So there's no problem when it comes to the idea of authority. However, authority is not sovereignty. The law comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
In my opinion, to vote for either of the 2 parties would be kufr, and this applies with equal force to the third party, the Liberal Democrats.
However, when we look at these political parties, we look at Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats, we find that fundamentally their policies contradict the values of the Muslim community. Their policies with regards to the youth, their policy with regards to social affairs, their policy with regards to governmental affairs, their policy with regards to international affairs, all contradict the interests of the Muslim community. Why? Because their policies, they do not accord with the interests of the Muslim community, which are the interests of Islam. And fundamentally, we've got a question: what are these political parties really there for? What are they going to provide for us?
So I'll give you a practical example. The government has just issued the Child Trust Fund. The Child Trust Fund will give every child in Britain some savings when they're born. Now, that disproportionately benefits the Muslim community here because poorer children receive more, and we have a very high level of deprivation here. But because Muslims have been involved in the Labour Party has decided that that trust fund must have an ethical option available for Muslims. Likewise, the party has decided that there must be Muslim mortgages available, and likewise the party has decided that the British government should and must fund Muslim schools. So it depends.
The Labour Party, it strikes me, is perhaps the most hypocritical of all political organisations in the history of this country. it has secured the Muslim vote by chicanery. It both bribes the Muslims and it blackmails them. It bribes them through the social services because so many Muslims are unemployed and living on benefit. And it blackmails them by threatening to reform the immigration laws so that either they have to go back or their relatives will not be allowed into this country.
I have a lot of Bengali people come to me and thank me for the help that I've given them on immigration and also on their housing case, because they know that I will do everything I can do. I can't promise them miracles, but they know that I will work very hard for them, and that's one of the reputations I have that I am proud of.
There are, however, many Muslim voters who do not want to participate in the mainstream politics due to their religious belief, especially due to the issue of sovereignty, which in a liberal democracy lies with man as opposed to God. What advice would you give to them?
Well, obviously there are different religious beliefs. I was speaking the other day to a young man from Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, and we were having a conversation about democracy, and he was saying to me, well, because of my religious beliefs, I can't vote. And then he said, oh, but by the way, my family's been on the housing waiting list for a really long time, and we want to make sure there are new houses. What are you going to do about that? And I was like, okay, well, it depends what you want. And that's why a lot of Muslims feel passionately that they need to improve their children's futures, and they believe that's what their God and what their religion would want them to do. Well, you have to ask yourselves, how do you do that? How are you going to do the practical things like get a better education?
You know, it's often said that the politics here in the West is different to the politics in Bangladesh or in Pakistan. I think in reality the politics is very similar. Look what's happening here. The political parties, the representatives of political parties, members of parliament, are coming to the Muslim community and saying, you vote for me and I will give you a mosque. You vote for me and I'll give you planning permission for your extension in the mosque. You vote for me and I'll give you services. That's no different to what Benazir Bhutto says when she goes to the population in Pakistan. You vote for me and I'll give you something in return. This is just bribery, quite frankly.
Labour and Tory have pursued a consistently anti-Islamic agenda, and I can prove that by reference to four things. One is the Rushdie affair, the second is Bosnia, the third is the Gulf War, and the fourth is the present conflict in Iraq.
They are trying to say that you can run your Islamic schools as long as your Islamic schools abide by our views of identity, abide by our views on different value systems, i.e. we adopt different value systems, we have to appreciate these value systems are on par with Islam. You have to teach citizenship, which is all about making the Muslim not proud of his ummah, but making the Muslim proud of his country, i.e. trying to enforce nationalism in the Muslim community. So actually when they give us funding, it has strings attached. It is really there to make sure that the Muslim community becomes a Western British Muslim community rather than an Islamic community. So I would say actually we will lose our independence as a community if we begin to scratch their back so that they scratch our backs.
All parties pursue an anti-Islamic agenda. They legislate on matters such as abortion, drugs, promiscuity, same-sex marriages, all of which means that they are going to introduce legislation that is contrary to the Sharia. So no Muslim in any conscience can support any of these parties or their immoral agendas. And by doing so, I think he in fact, personally, imperils his immortal soul, because he colludes in their policies and the crimes, both moral and political, of which they are all guilty.
What about Muslims becoming MPs? Can they serve the Muslim community by joining political parties? Is this the only way one can serve his or her community, or is there any alternative? However, some people argue that those candidates who became parliamentarians